Did you get any of that? You didn't get any of it. Okay. That's all right. We're dealing with the context of false teachers, and in Jude's day, false teachers abounded, just like they do today. They were twisting the grace of God and making it into a license for sin. That is, hey, listen, God gives grace, so sin more and more. And you really saw that last week in Jude 3 and 4. These false teachers really drove Jude to change his whole letter. He had initially intended to write to them about their common salvation, but he's had to change that because the false teachers were coming in, and the false teachers were trying to influence people, and they needed to be called out. So he had to write a completely different letter. And we never got the letter that Jude was initially intending to write. But we got the letter that God wanted to be written, and it was a letter against false teaching. And so Jude calls his readers to earnestly contend for the one true faith, and he calls them to separate from false teachers and from false teachings, because judgment is coming upon them. Judgment is. They'll face the judgment of God, and you don't want to be part of that. You don't want to be part of that. The Lord's judgment is sure. This isn't some unique teaching in the New Testament. We have the same, really very similar passage, very similar idea taught in 2 Peter that we looked at, the certainty of God's judgment. The Lord has always judged those that were in error. And we saw a couple different illustrations out of 2 Peter. Well, Jude's going to write about some things the same, some things different. The Lord has always judged people in error, even when it comes to his own people, Israel. And we see that in Jude 5. Jude 5, now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. So even God's people, Israel, were judged when they sinned. Jude wants his readers to remember God's judgment in the past, and he says, I desire to remind you. There's an importance here of, what's going on here? There we go. There's an importance here of being reminded of the judgment that took place in the past, so that we could avoid the judgment that's going to take place in the future. We see God's judgment against Israel here. Jude has called them already to earnestly contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints in verse 3. And these false teachers that had crept in Jude's day, they were presenting that need to contend for the faith even more. The judgment of God against those in errors presented the need even more to contend for the faith. Jude presents this reminder, even though they know all things once for all. Now, they don't know everything there is to know in the universe. That's not what this is saying. You know everything you need, and actually 2 Peter writes this in the first 4 verses. You have everything that you need for life and godliness through the true knowledge of him. So it's not, hey, listen, you know quantum physics. You know exactly. So we were talking about there's like Northern Lights. We could maybe see the Northern Lights tonight. Did anyone know that? There's a chance we could see the Northern Lights tonight. I think around like 11 o'clock or something, 10 or 11 o'clock. And I don't know if we'll see it or not, but... And I'm not asking you to elaborate on this. I'm not asking for a science lesson on it, but I think Josh asked me on the way over, hey, what are the Northern Lights? And I'm like, man, I don't remember. Something about magnetism and solar flare. I don't know. I don't remember. I knew at one point. Anyone here remember what it is? I don't know. Maybe a couple people. I don't know. Is Jude saying, hey, listen, you understand, every piece of information there is to know? And he's saying, you understand everything that you need to know as far as life and godliness goes, as far as everlasting. You know the truth. You know truth. The one true gospel. Salvation by grace through faith that was once for all handed down to the saints in verse 3. Now, there might be some people in the church, they think the judgment's not coming. Like the false teachers, for instance. The false teachers were living licentious lives. They were excusing sin in their lives. They didn't expect the judgment of God to come upon them. But what we see here is, first off, a little bit of a contrast. Listen, you know all things. You know the truth. You know the gospel that was once for all handed down to the saints. The gospel that we need to earnestly contend for. You know that. The false teachers, we already saw in verse 4, they're already turning the grace of God into licentiousness. They're already twisting the grace of God. You know all things. They don't. They're peddling false gospels. But one of the things that you also understand is that God's judgment is coming. God's judgment is coming because God's judgment has come. Now, you all know, like for instance, that the Lord saved the people out of the land of Egypt. About 1446 BC was the Exodus. You have the 10 plagues and all this stuff, right? You have the people of Israel leaving the land of Egypt, okay? Being delivered from the iron furnace of Egypt. And then what happens? What happens in the wilderness? A lot of stuff happens. Some things happen. No, there's a lot of grumbling happening. Some apostasy happening. There's one incident that happens. Kind of change. Well, there's the golden calf, right? There's one incident that happens that really kind of changes the course of Israel's future. You don't remember what that is? So Moses had gathered up a group of people at the Lord's direction, including Joshua, the son of, and in Hebrew it's pronounced Nun, but in English, in American, it's pronounced Nun, Joshua, the son of Nun. His name was Hoshea, and Moses called him Yehoshua, Joshua, which is the same name as Jesus. Right. Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of, anyone remember? Come on. Who was that? Jephunneh, yeah, right. Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and 10 other witnesses to go and spy out the land and see whether it was a good land. And what did they do? They went and they did see, and they came back, and they said, the sons of the Anakim are there. We can't go in there. These people are too strong and powerful for us. It's a great land. Yeah. But no, we can't go in there. We can't go in there. Right? And they rebelled against God. They rebelled against God. And then the people of Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. You have the people complaining, about meat. We don't want this man anymore. We want meat, and God sends quail. And along with it, a plague, right, that kills many thousands of people. And so what we see is that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. Listen, just a passage or two. The Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me, and how long will they not believe in me? Despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst, I will smite them with pestilence and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they. Of course, Moses pleads for them. We see the New Testament judgment against Israel in Hebrews 3:16 and 17. For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? We see God's judgment against even the people of Israel, even after they were delivered from the land of Egypt. We see in 1 Corinthians 5, check this out. Going the wrong direction here. 1 Corinthians 5. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the end of the ages have come. So what we're seeing here is the same generation that God delivered out of the iron furnace was judged. None of that generation, none of the men of that generation survive to go and inherit the promised land except Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, because they disobeyed God. The other men did. And so they died, not having inherited the promised land. They did not believe in the Lord. They died in the wilderness. God subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And there's a parallel between those men of Israel who died in the wilderness and the false teachers of Jude's day. Israel thinks they're the people of God, and they sin and they face the judgment of God. The false teachers claim to be the people of God, but instead they'll face his judgment and his wrath. They presumed upon his grace. Again, just go back just a verse or two here. The people of Israel are called to, or the church is called to make every effort, or to contend earnestly for the faith which was once handed down to all the saints. And these false teachers had turned the grace of God into licentiousness. These false teachers thought they were part of the people of God, but they were not, and they were going to face his judgment. If you look at verse 4, where they were long before marked out for this condemnation. Judgment was coming upon them. And so just like these people of Israel in verse 5, just like these people of Israel who had been delivered from the land of Egypt and faced God's judgment, that's the false teachers. That's the false teachers. There are a lot of church-going people that make the same mistake that these false teachers made, who turn the grace of our God into licentiousness. I mean, they're not going to admit it that way, but they're going to downplay sin. God understands, and they'll use that to kind of justify their sin. They'll maybe make a profession of salvation, but nothing changes. They'll keep living the way they've always lived and maybe rely on a single momentary emotional decision that they made, a prayer that they made at this one point in their lives and never actually repented, never actually took up their cross and followed him. Living in error, they'll face the judgment. That's not genuine faith. They'll face the judgment of God. The evidence of genuine faith is faithfulness to the end, right? Here, I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after having saved a people, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently, even after that happened, subsequently, the next thing that happened was he destroyed those who did not believe. And so we see that the Lord judged even Israel. You think you're going to escape judgment? You think the false teachers they're going to escape judgment? You think the Jehovah's Witnesses of today, or the Mormons of today, or the Muslims? You think they're going to escape God's judgment? You think the mainline denominationals who hold to they were asked. Isabel asked me this week, or maybe Roxanne asked me, "Hey, listen, they were studying. You were studying Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, right?" And I'm hearing it in the other room. I've got my door shut. I'm trying to write a sermon, and I'm overhearing something. I'm like, man, I really want to listen to some of this stuff. I'm overhearing this stuff about John Huss, and I'm like, yeah, I remember all that stuff. And they go through, and it's presenting a Martin Luther in a positive way, and it should to a certain extent. And it was like, yeah, hey, listen, what do the Lutherans believe? What are the Lutherans? I said, hey, listen, I got a whole book on denominations. Let's pull it up and I'll show you. And there's like 8 different main denominations within Lutheranism, but or something like that, maybe more. And each one of them are slightly different. But one thing that kind of consistently across the board that held was that grace, and you've heard me say this before, but it's nice to see it actually in writing somewhere. Grace is imparted by means of the sacraments of baptism and the Lord and communion. So really, this is, even though they claim, because the claim was that Martin Luther believed in salvation by grace alone, but the Lutheran Church today believes in a sacramental salvation where God's grace is being imparted through communion and through baptism. And through baptism, you're entering into the family of faith and all this stuff. You have to be confirmed later on, whatever. It's really not a whole lot different than Roman Catholic Church. Because if you really look at the Roman Catholic doctrine, you're going to see the same type of stuff. You're going to see salvation by faith in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and then you're going to see the same sacramental salvation. You're going to see it. They're not going to escape the judgment of God. They're not going to escape it because it's a false gospel. It's a false gospel. And so, hey, I applaud Abby for calling him out for peddling a false gospel. Don't be afraid to call people out for peddling a false gospel and telling your neighbors, don't believe it. It's not true. It's a false gospel. It is. And don't think that the false teachers are going to avoid judgment. Israel didn't avoid judgment when they sinned, when they were in error. We see that the Lord brought judgment even to angels when they fell in verse 6. Check this out. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So these angels were in a privileged position with God. They had a certain domain, a certain proper abode that God had given to them, and they sinned. Listen, God didn't create demons as demons. He didn't create evil. Everything that he made was good. Right? Everything he made was good. He created angels. By the way, you should have a certain understanding of the doctrine of angels and demons and Satan. Well, anyway, God created everything good. He created angels, but those angels rebelled against him. Those angels left their domain. They abandoned their proper abode. They sinned against God, and they followed Satan. They did not remain submissive to the Lord God Almighty. They wanted to be like God. Satan wanted to be like God. They wanted to take his place, and thus they fell. Now, I'm aware that some people have a very different understanding of this verse than I'm presenting to you. The way I'm presenting this verse is the way I read Genesis, and the way I read in a normal sense, and the way I read this passage in a normal sense. The angels did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. God has kept them in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Some people say this, and I believe this is false. I believe this is false teaching, but I want you to be aware of it. Some people say that angels left heaven, they came down in the form of men, had sex with women, and had evil babies, and the flood was the result. The Nephilim were the result. That's their view. All right. Let me repeat that just so you can kind of hear how wild and ridiculous that is. The angels left heaven, came down in the form of men, had sex with women, and had evil babies called the Nephilim, and that's why the flood came. I don't see that in Genesis. That doesn't fit the context of Genesis, and it doesn't fit the context of this passage either. Now, I understand that we're going to see some stuff in Sodom and Gomorrah, but what Peter's saying about Sodom and Gomorrah happened to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not a reference to what happened with the angels. I believe that's taking the Bible and taking a complete different step and jumping into something completely different that the Bible doesn't say. That's just my view, but I figured I'd make you aware of it. These angels were in a privileged position with God. They rebelled against him and fell in sin. And by the way, the commentaries say that. Most of the commentaries kind of hold that view, at least most of the decent commentaries. So it's kind of surprising. Really? Like, can't you see the mental gymnastics? Can't you see how you've made a jump from one thing into something completely different? But they don't really see that, apparently. So these angels are reserved for, they're being kept in eternal bonds under darkness. There's a sense in which they're facing judgment from God even now, but they're also reserved for eternal damnation, which we're going to read about in Revelation. When you get down to Revelation, the end of Revelation 19 and in Revelation 20, when they're thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Here they're kept in custody for the final judgment. Peter writes the same general truth in his second letter, which we just finished looking at not too long ago. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world and Sodom and Gomorrah, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. Remember this? Just a couple months ago we looked at this. There's a parallel between these fallen angels and the false teachers. There's a rebellion against God that's taking place. There's a rebellion against God's truth that's taking place. And it's not just the mainline denominations or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons or whatever else. Even this morning I was having a conversation about a guy from the Calvary Chapel movement. The Calvary Chapel movement, they're in cahoots with the Pentecostal charismatic movement. That's false doctrine, man. That's false doctrine. I know I sound like a broken record talking about the Pentecostal movement and how they're false teachers, but these guys, they really they're non-cessationists. They believe in God continuing to speak through prophets today and affirming that, authenticating that by signs and wonders and diverse miracles. Again, the question I ask is, I know you've heard me say this 100 times or more. If God is speaking through prophets today and he's authentic, what new message is being authenticated given that we have everything we need for life and godliness and given that we have a completed gospel? What new message would we need? Are you telling me that the New Testament, that the New Covenant is not sufficient and that we therefore need these extra prophecies? Well, if that's the case, then why not just believe the Book of Mormon? Because that's a quote-unquote additional testament, a New Testament, another testament of Jesus Christ, who is a completely different Jesus Christ than you know. They're just false teachers. Stay away from Pentecostal, charismatic, and people who are sympathetic. Stay away from them. And I know the Calvary Chapel movement's kind of like an almost an in-between, and Greg Laurie and all that stuff. They don't see him as bad, but they're sympathetic to the charismatic movement. You stay away from them. They're false teachers. Just having a conversation with a guy about them this morning. Anyway, what we see here in this passage is that the Lord judged even Israel when they were in error. He judged even the angels when they fell. And he judged Sodom and Gomorrah, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they... So what we have is these angels being kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And now we have this judgment being referenced in terms of Sodom and Gomorrah. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these, and the question is, who are these? And I'll get to that in a second. In the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Now these people here who say, hey, listen, angels came down in the form of men and had sex with women and had evil babies, and those evil babies, that's why the flood came. The Nephilim, that's why the flood came. Right? They're crazy, crazy view, and they're going to say, look, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah did just what the angels did. And they say these is a reference to the angels. But these here is a reference to the false teachers. All right, so the subject matter is we've moved on to the third illustration. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these false teachers who have turned the grace of God into licentiousness. That's what the false teachers have done. They turn the grace of God into a license for sin. So just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these false teachers of verses 3 and 4 indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, these guys are an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. This is the third example. Okay, and we could read about Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, and it's one of the most well-known examples of judgment in all of Scripture. It's an example that Peter mentions in that same chapter we were looking at earlier, just a few minutes ago. And if he condemned the cities of, remember we saw, if God did not spare the angels in verse 4, and And then you have, did not spare the ancient world, and verse 5, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. I mean, these are an example of what happens when you live in sin. And what was the sin at Sodom? Was it intolerance? Oh, man. Oh, the people of Sodom, they were just so intolerant. They didn't want to put the rainbow flag up. Hey, listen, the rainbow flag is celebrating God's promise that he'll never again flood the earth, right? Is it intolerance? Is that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Is it political conservatism? What was the sin? I mean, there's a couple. What was the sin at Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, what I heard some over here. I mean, sodomy was, hey, bring out the men that we might know them sexually. Homosexuality, right? Of course, you can say there's much more than that, right? Because they were inhospitable people and that type of stuff, right? But homosexuality was that was the big one. That was the big one there, right? It wasn't intolerance, right? God sent 3 angelic visitors to the town. Well, here, let me finish reading this verse, this passage. He condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. And if he rescued righteous Lot, we talked about, how in the world we're not going there. I'm going to refer you back to that sermon on how Peter can call Lot righteous, but we're not dealing with that right now. And if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, the unprincipled men of Sodom, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds, anamia, lawless, without law, against law. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. You remember what happened here. You remember what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, where God sends his angelic visitors to the town. Right before that, God has a conversation with, I was actually just talking about this, right? Hey, what if there are 50 people? What if there are 50? Will you destroy the city if there are 50 righteous people? What if there are 40 righteous people? Will you destroy the city? We get all the way down. What if there are 10? Let not the Lord's anger burn hot against me. Peradventure, there are 10 righteous people. Will you destroy the city for the sake of 10? I will not destroy it for 10. And I don't even find one righteous person there. I don't find one, unless you count Lot as righteous. Lot invites the angelic visitors into his home. The men of the town want to know them, want to have homosexual relations with them. Lot offers his 2 daughters. Hey, why don't you take my daughters? Why don't you, know them? God delivered Lot and was going to deliver his wife, and he delivered his 2 daughters and rained down fire and brimstone upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The men of Sodom indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh. What's that a reference to? In context, what's that a reference to? Is that a reference to eating uncooked meat? It's a reference to homosexuality. That's what it's a reference to. Different flesh, unnatural. And it brings you back to the language of Romans 1. Check this out. In Romans 1, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions for their women, exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way, the men also abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And God gave them over to a reprobate mind. This is not a good thing. Homosexuality is not a good thing. And the implication here is, look what's going on here. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, just like the false teachers. So now we're seeing what looks to be a sexual aspect, an immoral aspect to false teachers' thinking and theology. They had apparently sinful desires for same-sex relationships, and there is no way you can read the Bible. And in any honest way, there's no way you can read the Bible and come to any other conclusion besides the fact that homosexuality is sin. You can't. You can't. Now I know there are people who try to twist what God says. And some of those mainline denominations are some of those people, okay, who are out there, including the Lutheran Church, including the United Methodist Church, and some of these people who are looking the other way. Some of the organizations within Lutheranism and Methodism and some of these mainline denominations, they're looking the other way at homosexuality, and they're saying, "Oh, well, that's just a cultural thing." They didn't know back then. And they believe the lies of the world. And let me tell you something. The world's going to tell you lies about this. Hollywood is the chief sinner when it comes to this, because what Hollywood wants to do and what Disney wants to do, and it makes sense because Disney. Hey, listen, who isn't for Ron DeSantis right now? Anybody here, you're loving Ron DeSantis right now? I mean, absolutely loving Ron. I think he can beat Biden. I don't know if Trump can, because the Trump haters they'll vote against. They won't vote. Nobody will vote for Biden anymore. But they'll vote against Trump. That's the thing. DeSantis could win, but DeSantis took these guys on. He took these guys on because these guys basically, this whole law down there. Don't say. And listen, you're not supposed to talk about homosexuality under what grade? Third grade or something like that. It's like you can't talk about homosexuality in schools for third graders and under. And Disney's like, oh no, we're going to talk. Because they want to show it to everybody. They want to make normal what God calls evil. And now they're paying the price. Get DeSantis, put his fist down. So I'm loving DeSantis right now because I've been disgruntled with Disney for a long time. It's not just Disney, Hollywood. They want to normalize homosexuality. They want to try to convince the world, hey, listen, you love who you love. You're born this way. And instead of recognizing this is evil, this is wrong, this is gross immorality, is what it is. This is unnatural. Look at what God says in Romans 1 again. You see clear language. God gave them over to degrading passions, indecent acts. That's what God says about it. That's truth, not what Hollywood tells you when you're watching a basketball game, just trying to hope that the Knicks, hey, I just want the Knicks to win, man. And then a commercial goes on from Zales or something like that, and it's two dudes kissing. That's not truth. That's falsehood. That's Hollywood trying to make something that's evil seem normal. I'm going off. I got to get back. Reel me back in. Homosexuality is wrong. It is an abomination, and you need to be aware of that and know the truth. Don't accept as normal what God clearly calls evil. Don't call evil good and good evil. That's what's happening in the world right now. That's what's happening with Hollywood right now. And Sodom and Gomorrah, whose chief sin, I know some people say the chief sin is lack of hospitality, and that's part of it. But I mean, come on. The real sin here is sodomy. That's the real sin, is homosexuality. That's the real sin here. That's the real sin. Sodom and Gomorrah are punished as an example. As an example. So, you got this group of people today, and they'll be like, that's not nice. You're not being nice. Man, I don't know what to say, because all we have to do is read what God says about it. That's all you have to do. God does not speak kindly to it at all. In fact, in the Old Covenant, and we're not under the Old Covenant today, We're not the nation of Israel. We're not under a theocracy, a theocratic monarchy. We're not under that. But in the Old Covenant, in the law of Moses, in the economy of Moses, homosexuals would be put to death. They'd be put to death. Now, again, we're not in that economy now, but that just shows you how serious this. And so would people who would sleep with animals and stuff like that. That just shows you how serious this is. This is a big deal. It's a big deal. Here we see the punishment of eternal fire. This is hell. It's a reality that many people try to deny today. Some people don't believe in hell. They don't believe in the everlasting torment where the worm dieth not. They don't believe in that, where the fire is not quenched. They believe in something called annihilationism. God lets you burn up and you're done. That's not what we're seeing in Scripture. That's not what we see. Scriptures make it clear that hell is real against what some people believe. Even Jesus said, he will say to those on his left in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. He will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels," and of course, unbelievers, because they're the ones that are being told to depart. Judgment of Sodom is a picture of the judgment of the lost, and it's a picture of the judgment of the false teachers of Jude's day. Yet in the same way, these men also by dreaming defile the flesh and reject authority and revile angelic majesties. This is what we're seeing from these false teachers who, back in verse 4, had crept in unnoticed and who were marked out for condemnation, and they were ungodly persons, and they turned the grace of our God into licentiousness, into a license for sin, and they denied our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. And now in verse 8, these same men, also by dreaming, and we'll talk about that next week, because I really can't spend time in verse 8 this week because there's a lot to say about it. But just to kind of finish the thought. In the same way as these men, also by dreaming, defile the flesh. Same idea. Defile the flesh. Reject authority. Revile angelic majesties. The judgment of God upon false teachers is sure. The Lord judged even Israel when they were in error. The Lord judged angels when they were in error, when they fell, and he judged Sodom and Gomorrah because of their sin. How will he not judge the false teachers of Jude's day? And how will he not judge the false teachers of our day? Which is why I call them what they are. I'm not going to, listen, you can't convince me to not call them false teachers. We have false teachers galore today. Are they the exact same as the false teachers of Jude's day? No. Apparently, Jude's false teachers were taking the grace of God and perhaps even justifying it for sexual immorality even. We don't really see too many cults like that today. But we have false teachers out there. And we have false teachers who do away with certain moral standards and do away with and twist the gospel and spread that stuff around communities and churches. And there are other things like easy believism, which is false. It's false understanding of the gospel, easy believism and works-based salvation and the sacraments, this quote-unquote sacraments, which is a sacrament is a work whereby you merit the favor of God. We don't believe in sacraments, not in that term by any means, but the sacraments impart grace, which is just a works-based sacramental salvation. And again, the Roman Catholics, the mainline denominationals, the Pentecostals, the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, they're all over the place. They're all over the place. And we know that false teachers will face the judgment of God because the judgment of God is certain. It's sure to happen. And that calls us all the more earnestly to, as Jude writes in verse 3, to contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all handed down to the saints, lest we embrace false teaching and fall into the same judgment. Contend earnestly for the faith. Let's take our hymnals, and I don't have the number. You have it?